Only a few times in NFL history has a team had three receivers go for 1,000 yards in the same season. The Chicago Bears have a real shot to do it with DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, and Keenan Allen, but the big key will be having all three of them play a full 17 games.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can find all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On the show today, we look at some Chicago Bears stat projections for a bunch of individual players across this roster, starting with the receivers going for 1,000 yards each, racing for 1,000 yards on the season, and what that path might look like. Because, well, I don't think it's likely, it's not impossible, and it's not out of the question. We'll look at a couple of historical comparisons as well, but then look at that in the context of Caleb Williams' production, the other receivers not named Odunze, Allen, and Moore, including, your tight ends and your running backs, etc. We'll also then look at some defensive projections as well and how that then fits the big team picture compared to other teams and what this team might be able to accomplish then, given what those individual players perform statistically. But I want to start with this question about the three receivers because I think that's the most interesting aspect of this. How many receiving yards are there really to go around between DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, and Keenan Allen? Because let's not forget, receiving yards also need to go around to then Cole Kmet, maybe Gerald Everett, maybe Tyler Scott, and then the running backs in the backfield are going to get some of the receiving yards as well. So it's hard to split up enough yards to go around where everybody gets enough yards and all three of those wide receivers get to 1,000 yards. It would certainly require Caleb Williams to throw for significantly over 3,000 yards. If you're putting 3,000 of them going to just those three guys, then you got to figure the rest of those yards, you have to split then, if you're going to be a 4,000-yard quarterback, then you'd split 1,000 yards between Swift and Kmet and Everett and every other receiver on the roster, and maybe that's doable, but it certainly is going to be tricky because one of the other key things here is just durability, health, that Caleb stays healthy for 17 games, and that all three of those receivers are on the field for 17 games. Statistically, on average, most players in the NFL miss a game or two or more, but at least a game or two during any given regular season. It's more common for a player to miss a game than to have a full 17-game season, especially in this elongated 17-game format. And so what I want to sort of look at here is some stat projections for the Bears. These come from ESPN fantasy football expert Mike Clay. If you ever play ESPN fantasy and they have like projected stats for players, he's the guy who projects those. And it's not to say that his projections are always perfect or spot on or something we need to take as gospel, but I think it's a good starting point of like where expectations might be for the players on the Bears offense. And as Clay has it projected for this upcoming season, he has Caleb Williams throwing for 3,537 yards, 23 touchdowns, and 13 interceptions across notably 15 games, not a full 17-game season. He doesn't have any players in the Bears offense playing a full 17 games. And so that's one of the factors here that slightly lowers their production. I mean, on a per-game basis, that would leave Caleb at a 17-game season pace at 4,000 passing yards here. But in 15 games, it's 3,500 passing yards, 23 touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. And so he splits up those 3,500 passing yards with just over 1,000 to DJ Moore, and then has Keenan Allen with 882 and Rome Odunze with 804. I'll notice again specifically that that's DJ Moore in 15 games, Rome Odunze in 15 games, and Keenan Allen in 14 games, projecting one fewer game for Allen, I think, because of age and just that may make him more likely to deal with an injury perhaps than Moore and Odunze, who are younger in general. But so across a 17-game season, I did the math. That would make, obviously, Moore's already 1,000 yards here. At that pace, if Keenan Allen played 17 games under this projection, that would also put him over 1,000 yards. But it would leave Rome Odunze just short at 911. To be 1,000, and 911 for those three receivers at these projections from Mike Clay, which would be a Caleb Williams on pace for 4,000 yards. It's still hard to get three receivers up to 1,000 because you still got to get 500 plus yards for Cole Kmet in the projection here, another about 200 for Gerald Everett, 250 for DeAndre Swift out of the backfield. The other running backs take a couple hundred as well. So the numbers go around quickly. Overall, I think it's about 2,800 to the wide receivers, 700 to the tight ends, and 500 to the running backs is how he has that split up. So it's very close to three 1,000-yard receivers, but it's not quite there. And that's fine. It's not going to be a disappointing season if the Bears don't quite get 1,000 yards out of all three of those wide receivers. It's only happened, I think, 5 times in NFL history. Most recently was in 2008. The Arizona Cardinals did it with Larry Fitzgerald, Anquan Bolden, and Steve Breston all broke that 1,000-yard mark. But that means it's been almost 15, 16, 17 years coming up now since we've had 3 1,000-yard receivers in the NFL. Before that, it was the 2004 Colts with Marvin Harrison, Reggie Wayne, and Brandon Stokely, all breaking the 1,000-yard mark. And then there are a couple teams in the 90s and the 80s that did it. But really, it's been about 5 teams in NFL history to have a set of 3 receivers all get 1,000 yards. We have seen a couple of teams come close in recent years that didn't quite get 1,000, but had 3 guys say over 900. This past season, the Vikings had Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and the tight end TJ Hawkinson were all over 900 yards, but only Jefferson broke the 1,000-yard mark. And a couple of seasons ago, Keenan Allen and the Los Angeles Chargers in 2019. Allen and Mike Williams were both 1,000-yard receivers, and Austin Eckler had 993, 7 yards short of having that trio of 1,000 yards in 2019. Seen a couple teams do it in 2014, 2012, 2011. So 3 players over 900 is what I think is realistic or more attainable for the Chicago Bears here, as opposed to 3 over 1,000 really would take Caleb playing 17 games, all 3 of those receivers playing 17 games, and all 3 of those receivers being at their best, not being banged up in any of those 17 games either, really being at full speed, full pace. This offense is clicking and dialed in. And even then, it's still a lot to ask, not because they're not good enough to be 1,000-yard receivers, but because Cole Kmet is good enough to be a 600-yard guy. Gerald Everett can be a multi-100-yard guy as a backup tight end. You got multiple backs in the backfield in Swift and Roshan Johnson that can be multi-100-yard guys. And those receivers are going to be covered sometimes, and they're not going to force the ball to those receivers at all times. And that's where getting all the way up to 1,000 yards is just a little bit tricky for all 3, but it's definitely not out of the question given how close we've seen other teams come in recent years and just how good this receiving core is for the Bears if they can stay fully healthy for a full 17 games instead of just 15, 14, or 16 and miss a couple games here. That can be the difference between 3 1,000-yard receivers and 3 900-yard receivers or 3 800-yard receivers like Mike Clay has them projected here. Briefly, I'll mention he's got DeAndre Swift rushing for 835 yards as the Bears' leading rusher, Khalil Herbert rushing for 476, and Roshan Johnson at 324. So combining for over 1,500 yards rushing just split quite a bit between those 3 running backs there. He also has, Bagent coming in for a couple games for Caleb Williams. I mean, he projects every player's fantasy stats line here. Anybody who's going to take a snap on offense, who's going to have some kind of rushing or receiving or passing, he's got all the stats for. He also has all the numbers for defense as well. And I think it's an interesting look at where the expectations are for this Bears defense that can and should be very good, but is going to have some limitations. And how that bears out over the stat lines, I think, is reflective of where this team is right now. So we'll take a look at some of the defensive projections next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events, especially over the summer. If you want to get out and see some live baseball, I went to a game for Father's Day this past weekend with both of my parents and had a great time. And we got our seats from Gametime because we get to see our view from our seat within the stadium, so we know exactly what we're getting with our ticket purchase. And with Gametime's all-in pricing, You're never going to get any of those added fees bumped up right at checkout that makes tickets cost way more than you think. So whether you want to go see the Bears this upcoming season or concerts, comedy shows, theater performances, I mean, you name it. If it's a live event in your area, you could find great deals at Gametime. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This Chicago Bears defense has been building up high expectations throughout this offseason so far because of all the pieces they kept together, because of how well they've reportedly performed at OTAs and minicamp, and just having a lot of younger players getting, slightly farther along in their careers to where they're settling in a little bit more and aren't so young and inexperienced and are approaching, more of their true prime and are not just young players making mistakes, but now guys who are locked in and dialed in. And so we hear players refer to them as a top 5 defense. Oh, this is going to be a top 5 defense. And there certainly should be a very good defense. And they played at the end of last season very well after a little bit of a slow start there. But it's another thing to be a top 5 defense over the course of an entire season. And we still have some questions about what's going to happen on this defensive line and how that has ripple effects elsewhere on the roster. So I was interested to see how this might line up with stat projections. And I think it kind of aligns where you might expect, where you look across the defensive line and the sack numbers are definitely on the low end, and it's easy to get concerned there, but you like what you're seeing from a lot of the guys on the back end in the secondary, but even projecting a little bit of regression there in terms of the turnovers that the Bears generated last season. The players are saying, hey, the goal this year again is 20 interceptions, 20 forced fumbles, and that's hard to keep up from season to season. But even if we go like position group by position group here on the defensive stats, right, along the interior of the defensive line, rolling with right now Andrew Billings, Gervon Dexter, Zach Pickens, and Byron Cowart as the top 4 defensive tackles here. He's got about 2 sacks for Billings, 3 for Dexter, 2 for Pickens, and 1 for Cowart off of the bench. I mean, that's a combined 8 sacks. He does some decimals here that makes it 8.5, 8.8 in total, but about 3 sacks for Dexter and 2 sacks for Pickens doesn't necessarily feel like enough there, right? I think when we talk about Dexter stepping into that 3-technique pass rusher role, sacks are certainly not the end-all, be-all there. It's not the perfect measurement of pass rush productivity, but it is at least a somewhat universal measurement that we can all sort of relate to as like, okay, a foundational, okay, I know roughly how good this many sacks is versus, we know what a 10-sack season is versus a 3-sack season. It's something, it's a anchor point that we can kind of come back to. And this is kind of projecting that, hey, we've seen some flashes from Dexter, but until he proves it, like, can you project more than 3 or 4 sacks from him? Well, maybe you can hope for 3 or 4 or more sacks from him. That's hard to say. But until we see it, that's about what you project. I mean, same with Zach Pickens. So these are not super productive players last season, and maybe they'll be more productive this season, but there's not a lot to base that off of other than optimism and hope and development and projection, and that's great, and we should absolutely feel and think and believe those things. But when you're trying to be correct in predicting a stat, you got to go with what you know for sure, what you've seen so far, and that's kind of where they are with those guys. So I think it's an underwhelming interior pass rush there, whereas I think on the edge you get something a little bit closer to what you're looking for. Montez Sweat with 9 sacks, DeMarcus Walker with 6, Dominique Robinson with 3, Jacob Martin also with 3. He's got him at 3.5 here, but we're just doing some quick rounding here to get 22 total sacks out of the edge rusher group. That feels a little bit better, right? You'd hope Sweat can get to that 10-sack number. It seems like a slight step back for him to be down at 9, but okay, it's not out of the question there. DeMarcus Walker to 6 would be an improvement from where he was last season, so that's projecting a bigger role for him and more production as a result, closer to that 7-sack season he had 2 years ago with the Tennessee Titans. So, okay, we're making some progress there. And then even Dominique Robinson as your number 3 edge rusher, at least getting to 3 sacks, and Jake Martin as the number 4, also getting 3 sacks. Like, that's better production from your pass rushing depth than even what it felt like the Bears were getting last season, where a lot of those guys really underachieved in that regard. So it's like, okay, that's something, and especially if they can still add another pass rusher before the start of training camp, maybe you can start to piece something together with the defensive line. You can add in some sacks where, they also count blitzing sacks from the linebackers, adding 4 sacks between Edwards and Edmonds and Sanborn. The cornerbacks, he has Kyler Gordon with a couple of sacks on blitzes, the safeties with a couple of sacks as well. And all of a sudden, even if the defensive line is a little bit underwhelming on the sack total, especially the interior, you're still up to 39 total sacks as a defense, which, is not like a dominating sack number by any means, but it's not the bottom of the NFL. It's lower on the NFL scale, but it's not like worst pass rush in the NFL level of sack production there. The projections from Mike Clay here at ESPN also have the interception numbers down a little bit, though, and that one is the one to me that I think is a little bit of an overcorrection. Last year, the Bears had 22 interceptions, tied for the most in the NFL. Realistically, are they going to tie for most interceptions in the NFL again? Probably not. They were one of only 2 teams that even broke 20 last season. So, to have them come down from 22, I'm okay with. But he's got them down to 14. He's got 3 for Brisker, 2 for Jalen Johnson, 2 for Tyreek Stevenson, 1 for Kyler Gordon, 1 for each of the linebackers, 1 for Kevin Byard. Like, all around there, those all feel like a little bit low. I think 3 for Brisker I'm fine with, but I think Jalen Johnson could get more than 2 this season. He dropped a couple of should-have-been interceptions last season. I think you could put Jalen Johnson for 3 or 4 picks. I think Tyreek Stevenson at 2 or 3 is fine. Kyler Gordon should be at least 2, maybe 3, potential for more there. Kevin Byard at 1, I think you can get 2 or maybe 3 out of Byard. And okay, you start to add a few there, and maybe even one of the defensive linemen gets an INT on a batted pass or something. And all of a sudden, you go from the 14 he's got projected here to maybe 18 or 19. And let's see, 18 would have been 3rd in the NFL last season. So, if you can, I think you can add 2 or 3 or 4 more interceptions across the guys that they have projected here and get yourself to a very good interception number on these sacks. So that's where, interception number on these projections. So that's where I think, okay, maybe the sack numbers I think are a little bit more realistic based on what we've seen. I think the interception numbers are projecting a regression for this defense that I'm not sure that they were too over the top last season. It wasn't like we had that year a couple years ago when Eddie Jackson had, 6, I think, interceptions. That was 2018. Gosh, that was longer ago than I thought it was. But okay, yeah, Eddie Jackson's not going to get 6 interceptions every season. We can say that, okay, in one of those types of years when a guy has 6 or more, that's not going to be sustainable. But Jalen Johnson had 4 last season and could have had a couple more than that. Kyler Gordon had 3 as a rookie, 2 this past season. You should expect those guys to be able to maintain those kind of numbers. And for these projections to be a little bit lower than that, feel too low. So I think the interceptions will be a little bit higher than this. The sacks will depend on if they add more on the defensive line, but this feels about right based on what we can, if we're trying to be as realistic as possible and not just optimistic about the young guys developing, but as realistic as you can. That seems about right for where the likes of Gervon Dexter and Zach Pickens, we still need to see them do it before we can say, yeah, 6-8 sacks from Dexter this season. Certainly let's hope for it. Let's aim for it. Let's be optimistic about it, but let's also be realistic and say, well, let's see him do it first. It takes defensive linemen, especially interior guys, a little bit longer to adjust to the NFL and get to their peak. And year 2 for a raw prospect like that isn't always as quick as it comes together for Dexter. So I'm not horribly upset with the rankings. Kind of like the offense, right? I think it's generally pretty close. And playing time plays a factor in those things as well. And I think a couple tweaks here and there, and I think those are fairly realistic numbers for the defense. So what I want to do now is take a step back and look at, okay, if we're not arguing too much about these, maybe a few things here and there, but generally on the right pace of these projections are fairly realistic. They're not aggressively low. Maybe they're slightly lower than we might think. They're not aggressively low, and they're certainly not above much of what we would expect. Where would that leave them compared to the rest of the NFL? Because he projects every team and every player, and it's kind of a good way of saying okay, where would the Bears slot in then if this was about how things go? And it gives us a sense of how the team stacks up. So we'll look at kind of the league-wide picture here and also how that applies to their schedule pretty directly next on Locked On Bears. Don't forget, as part of the Locked On Podcast Network here. We've got you covered with a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming and debate television you get on ESPN and Fox Sports all day. The Locked On Sports Today live stream brings you the can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And as we look at our team every day, we also like to take a step back and look more broadly and see how our team fits into the rest of the league and the rest of the teams. Like, okay, if we're saying the Bears are down here at about 39 sacks, and I think the 14 interception number is a little bit too low, but we can go along with that for a minute here. And we talked about Caleb throwing for about 3,500 yards, the receivers 1,000 yards, almost 900 yards, and 800 yards across the three of them. Like, okay, those are all really great numbers for Bears offenses, certainly. Maybe a little bit underwhelming for Bears defenses, but part of how that matters is how that fits in with the rest of the NFL. And as part of Mike Clay's projections over at ESPN, he also then takes all those numbers and puts them together and shows you, hey, here's where each team ranks in each of those categories. And so, he both grades the unit and looks at their stat ranking. So, like, he grades the Bears' defense overall as 11th and offense overall as 18th and puts the team then at 15th, where he's got the interior defensive line graded pretty low, the edge graded medium low, but then the back seven, the linebackers, the cornerbacks, and the safeties are all graded pretty well and high for him. And a similar story on offense where I think because Caleb's a rookie, QB grades a little bit on the lower end, running back is average, and then receivers, tight end, and even offensive line get some pretty good grades there from Mike Clay. So kind of what you would expect, maybe quarterback a little lower than you might think, but everything else seems to kind of check out. About maybe running back's a little low too, but not not egregiously low. I think we all agree that the defensive line is a work in progress here that's not where it needs to be. But from a statistical standpoint, like a rookie season from Caleb of 3,500 yards doesn't seem crazy low. Like that seems like a pretty healthy, realistic goal for him to shoot for. And that would put the Bears team passing at 24th in the NFL. I mean, that's at the top of the bottom third in the league in passing. And that's okay to me. Like, to me, it's not about like, oh, Caleb has to rank top 10 in passing or Caleb has to rank top 15 in passing. Like, where his stat finishes really is insignificant to me this season. Like, as long as he looks good, looks the part, makes the kind of plays that we expect from him, doesn't look lost at the NFL stage, you know what I mean? Just kind of fits in and comes along the way a rookie does with ups and downs, then I don't really care if he ranks 24th in yards. And like, they have him 14th in touchdowns, 5th in interceptions, 13th in sacks. I mean, this is average to below average statistics for a quarterback, but I think the performance can be above even what the statistical numbers there are. Still with the rushing game, he's got the Bears at 10th in rushing yards. Okay, top 10 rushing team. And obviously I think yards per carry would be a better measurement there, and that's not exactly reflected here, but the 12th most rushing attempts of any team compared to like the 24th most passing attempts. So clearly like trying to lean on the running game to help Caleb Williams here. I'm on board with. Again, might cut into Caleb Williams' stat totals, but I'm not as worried about Caleb Williams' stat totals, worried about Caleb Williams' performances individually. And then defensively, he's got them 29th in sacks, which, okay, it's not the worst, but it's definitely at the bottom there. But given the sort of valid concerns about the interior of this defensive line and the edge rushers not named Montez Sweat, I don't think that's a horrible, slight on the Bears or a miscalculation. Like, yeah, they're probably going to be towards the bottom in sacks until they address the defensive line in some additional way. But 6th in interceptions, that's what I'm surprised here. He's got him with only 14 interceptions, but among his projections, he has that as 6. So I think maybe across the board, he's under projecting every defense's interceptions, because like last year, 14 interceptions, I think would have ranked like 20th, or definitely outside of the top 15 in interceptions there. The Bears were tied for first at 22. A few teams had 18, 17, and 16 that were all like in the top 10. So I think overall, like finishing 6th in interceptions sounds about right to me for the Bears this season. But I think to finish 6th, you would have to accumulate more than 14, which he has his projections right now here. So that's where I think the ranking is correct, but the stat itself is aimed a little bit too low from Mike Clay. And I think overall he ranks the defense and special teams at 12th in the NFL when he talks about, the kickoff, where he projects kickoff and punt return yards of DeAndre Carter, who the team just signed. And, those are pretty, average run-of-the-mill numbers that we don't need to take the time to go through here. So all in all, like, it seems about right. Like, okay, passing game statistically a little bit below average, but maybe performs well. Running game is solid. Pass rush is underwhelming, but back end of the defense is really solid. Interceptions are solid. Turnovers are there. Like, that generally sounds about where we think the Bears might be. Again, we can nitpick on certain aspects of it. I think he's under projecting a little bit in a few of those areas, but not so far off the mark that it's totally dismissed and nothing to agree with there. And so I like that he then takes that and applies this to the Bears' schedule as well and looks at every single game and based on these projections, how those players might do. And he projects 9 wins for the Bears, which would rank 14th in the NFL based on that. And he even gives a win probability for each game. And if you kind of go through, there's a number of games that are clearly above 50%. There are only 4 games that are below 50%, and then a handful of games that are hovering right around 50%. I think that's kind of where the probability math starts to math out here. So below 50% win probability against the Texans in week 2, the Lions in week 13 on the road, I should say, at Detroit, and then at the San Francisco 49ers, at home against Detroit, and then week 18 at home against Green Bay. 5 games below 50% projected winning probability. If you lost all those games and won the rest, you'd be 13-5, or 12-5 under the new record. Obviously, then if you go to all the 50-50 games and split those 50-50, I think that's how you get closer to the 9-win projection here. But clearly sees a win against the Titans in week 1, high win percentage there, high win percentage against the Panthers in week 5, Commanders, Cardinals, and Patriots in 8, 9, and 10, the Vikings in 12, and the Seahawks in 17. And then more your coin toss games are like the Colts in week 3, the Rams in week 4, the Jaguars in week 6, the Packers at home in week 11. And then I guess those are pretty much the main coin toss games that are all within like a few percentage points of 55. And like, I think when I look at this, that feels kind of about right for me too. Like, yeah, there are 3 or 4 games that just feel really tough, that are really going to be hard to pencil in a win for the Bears on paper right now. And then there are 5 or 6 games that feel pretty darn easy. It feels like it's going to be hard to lose. And then that leaves, I didn't do the math there, but that leaves 4 or 5 games in the middle that are all kind of coin tosses where it's like, it depends. How good are the Rams this season? It depends. How good are the Seahawks this season? How good are the Packers? How good are the Vikings? I mean, we don't even know how good the Bears are going to be. So it's like, I think that's on pace. And if you do the probability math there, that gets you to about 9 wins. And that's about where I project this team, a 9 or 10 win team that maybe about 14th in the NFL would be pushing for that 7th wildcard seed there, that 7th seed, the wildcard spot in the NFC. Like, it's about where I see this team right now, where you could see things if everything goes well, you win some of those 50-50 games, your stat projections go a little bit higher, you win 10 games, maybe even 11 games, and you're, the 5 or the 6 seed instead. Or you lose a few more of those 50-50 games and your projections don't get much better than that, and maybe you end up just outside the playoffs at 8 wins or 9 wins and you lose a couple of those 50-50 games. Like, this all seems like a fairly realistic, maybe harsh, but realistic projections for how things might go for the Chicago Bears this season. I'd love to hear what you think, though. Like, what were the parts you might disagree with the most there, and what were the projections you might agree with the most? Again, those are Mike Clay of ESPN, not mine, but I do generally think a lot of them are on the right track here. So I'd love to hear from you, though, on where you think they're closest on the mark and also maybe missing the mark the most. Let us know in the comments here in the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, or you can tweet us at Locked On Bears or post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to the podcast, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Again, we're in the slower part of the offseason, so we're not a full 5 days a week this time of year, but we're officially less than a month until Bears rookies report to training camp, because they report early because of the Hall of Fame game. So, like, this isn't going to last long. We're not going to be slow for very long here. We're going to have Bears football in literally less than a month. It's crazy how quickly the offseason goes by. I'm super glad for it. I hope you are too. And no matter what, in the downtime or the uptime, the training camp time, preseason, regular season, offseason, any season, you could be sure that every single time you tune into the Locked On Bears podcast, you're going to get another opportunity to bear down.